Do you believe me? That question, spoken by a 4-year-old girl, her small voice barely cutting through the heavy silence of a mansion corridor, would haunt a mafia boss long after he had burned down his own empire to find the answer. Let me take you back to where it all began. Adrian Moretti was a man who measured everything. Time, risk, loyalty, the cost of a single mistake. For 39 years, he had built a world where emotion was weakness, and weakness was a door that could be opened by the wrong hands. He had no wife, no children, no one close enough to matter. The estate he ruled sat behind tall iron gates, staff moving through its corridors with lowered heads, never standing closer than 3 paces. The silence was a rule written into the walls. But on an ordinary afternoon, walking past the lake that bordered his property, Adrian stopped cold. A small girl sat alone on the grass, completely absorbed in her drawing. She was the daughter of his housekeeper, Grace. 4 years old, with brown hair that had escaped its ponytail and a smudge of graphite on her cheek. She didn't see him. She never looked up. Curious, he stepped closer and glanced down at the page. What he saw froze him where he stood. The drawing was simple, uneven lines and careful strokes only a child could make. A man in a dark vest sat alone by the water's edge. Broad shoulders, straight posture, head bowed slightly. There was no mistaking it. It was him, the man she had never once spoken to, but had watched with the strange, gentle attention only children possess. And above the man's head, filling nearly half the page, was a great yellow sun. Warm, bright, round. Around his feet, flowers of every color she could reach, red, pink, blue, orange, all leaning toward him, as if they wanted to be near him. But no one had ever looked at Adrian that way. Not the boss they feared, not the power they envied. Only a man beside the water, under a sun, surrounded by flowers. Something tightened in his chest. A place he had long stopped noticing. He took one slow step back, then another. Careful not to let his shadow fall across her page. He didn't want her to lift her head. He didn't want to become for her what everyone else saw. That night, in his study, Adrian stood at the tall window for hours. The light lowered over the garden. He couldn't name the feeling in his chest. For the first time in more years than he cared to remember, he had no words for what he felt. Here's what you need to understand about Adrian Moretti. Before that afternoon, he was the head of one of the most feared families on the Eastern Coast. Men whispered his name in rooms where quiet men made loud decisions. He had inherited an empire from his father and made it larger, colder, more disciplined. Men who crossed him disappeared. Men who served him well were paid, protected, and reminded, without a word, exactly where the line stood. The estate itself was a fortress, a long private road, tall iron gates, gardens trimmed to the exact inch, a lake that reflected the sky like polished stone, and a house so large that entire corridors stood empty for weeks without anyone noticing. Inside, the silence was almost a rule. Long hallways ran between rooms no one had entered in years. In the great dining room stood a table long enough for 20. Only one chair was ever drawn back. Only one plate was ever set. Marco, Adrian's right-hand man, stepped into the study without knocking that evening. He had earned that right years ago. The Genoa shipment cleared, he said. The lawyers need you tomorrow at 9. Alderman Ross wants a meeting. I told him next week. Adrian nodded once. Marco left, closing the door with the same careful quiet everyone in the house had learned. Adrian had built his life on a single conviction. After the betrayals wrapped inside smiles. After the men who embraced him on Sunday and moved against him on Monday. After friends who became names in obituaries. He had come to believe that emotion was only another word for weakness. Weakness was a door, and doors could be opened by the wrong hand. So he had allowed no one close enough to matter. But something began to shift after that afternoon by the lake. In the days that followed, Adrian started noticing her. The little girl with the sketchbook. On a Tuesday morning, he turned a corner on the second floor and found her sitting cross-legged on the polished floor, drawing the pale gray veins that ran through the marble tiles. She didn't see him. He watched for perhaps 5 seconds, then walked on. 2 days later, he passed the library and saw her kneeling on the wide window seat, her nose almost touching the glass. A flock of dark birds had gathered on the maple tree outside. Her pencil was already halfway down the page. Her lips were moving without sound, counting them. He didn't go in. On a warm afternoon, He walked through the garden and found her seated near the roses. A butterfly, orange and black, had settled on a leaf near her hand. She was as still as a photograph. Her pencil hovered without touching the paper, waiting for the creature to fold its wings just once more so she could remember the pattern. He began to notice something that made him pause each time he thought of it. She didn't draw the way other children drew. She didn't invent. She recorded, and the details she caught were details he himself had missed. The faint white scar along Marco's right wrist, a scar Adrian had never once looked at in more than a decade, appeared in one of her sketches. A small pale line under a rolled-back sleeve that evening, Adrian overheard the head housekeeper speaking in the back kitchen. "The little Miller girl," she was saying, "has no one her age here. She talks to no one but her mother and that sketchbook. Poor thing. It's her only friend." The word stayed with him. Later that night, after the main house had gone dark, he stepped out through the back door and walked along the path toward the staff quarters. He didn't know why. He stopped a short distance from the small building. In the second window from the end, a warm yellow light was still burning. Through the thin curtain, he could see Grace seated on the edge of a small bed, a book open in her hands, a smaller figure curled beneath a blanket. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back. The next afternoon, a black sedan rolled up the private road and stopped at the front steps. That outstepped a man every member of the household knew by sight. Dr. Julian Voss, 50 years old, silver hair combed back neatly, thin gold-rimmed glasses low on his nose. His voice was warm and slow, the kind of voice that had calmed frightened patients for more than half his life. In one hand, he carried a brown leather briefcase, worn soft at the corners from long use. Julian had been the Moretti family doctor for as long as anyone could remember. He had cared for Adrienne's father through the last years of his illness, sitting by the old man's bedside night after night when even the nurses had gone home. He was the only man left in Adrienne's life who had known him before the Empire, before the killings, before the walls. For that reason alone, Julian was the one man Adrienne trusted without measurement. He was also, by Adrienne's own appointment, the manager of the Moretti Charitable Foundation, the quiet arm of the family's wealth that funded orphanages, small clinics, and community medical centers in towns Adrienne had never set foot in. Julian signed the papers. Julian visited the sites. Julian returned each quarter with reports and photographs and warm assurances. Tea was served in the front sitting room. The two men sat across from each other in tall wingback chairs. Julian rested his briefcase against the leg of his chair without opening it. "The Riverbend Center will be ready by the end of next month," Julian said, stirring his tea slowly. "The Hilltop Clinic hired its 2 new pediatricians last week. Everything is in order." Adrian nodded. He asked no further questions. He hadn't asked further questions in almost 10 years. Julian smiled his familiar gentle smile and set down his cup. "I heard something amusing from the housekeeper," he said lightly, as if in passing. "A small painting you happened to see the other afternoon. By the housekeeper's child." Adrian didn't answer. He lifted his cup, drank once, and set it down. His eyes rested on the far window, not on Julian's face. A very small silence passed. A guest might not have even noticed, but Julian felt it. His smile didn't waver, but behind his glasses, his eyes marked it. "Children draw the strangest things," Julian said easily, and reached for another biscuit. A quarter of an hour later, he rose to leave. His briefcase was once again in his hand. At the door, he offered Adrian the same warm nod he had offered for decades. Then he walked out to his car and drove away. What Adrian didn't know on that quiet afternoon, the truth that had been growing beneath the polished floors of his own house for almost a decade, was this: for nearly 10 years, Julian Voss had been quietly draining the Moretti Charitable Foundation of millions. That the method was patient and clean. Julian had built on paper an entire network of children's centers and community clinics that did not exist. Each one had a name, a registration, a stamped address, a full set of monthly invoices. Riverbend, Hilltop, Ashwood, Fairview. On paper, they employed nurses and teachers and cooks. On paper, they served hundreds of children a month. In reality, the addresses were empty lots on the far edge of small towns, or half-collapsed buildings whose owners had died years ago. Weeds grew through cracked pavement. Rusted padlocks hung on doors that hadn't been opened in a generation. Julian hadn't done it alone. Inside the foundation's administrative office worked a middle-aged finance officer, a small, careful man with a nervous smile, who moved the numbers exactly as Julian instructed. Money left the foundation's main account under one name, passed through 3 intermediary companies, Delaware, the Bahamas, Cyprus, before arriving, cleaned and quiet, in a private account in Geneva. Julian kept 2 sets of books. The pristine set he handed Adrian every quarter, and the true one, locked inside the old East Wing archive of the estate itself, a corridor of dusty shelves no one on the household staff had entered in years. Julian, as the trusted family doctor with access to the medical records stored there, had claimed it for his own quiet purposes long ago. 2 afternoons later, on a slow, warm Thursday, Grace was called into the main house to help with seasonal dusting. She brought Mia along, as she often did, and sat her in a small side chair with strict instructions. "Sit here. Do not wander. Do not go near the boss." Mia nodded seriously. Her sketchbook was already open in her lap, but children with sketchbooks and quiet houses are not made for sitting still. Within 20 minutes, Grace was deep in conversation with the head housekeeper in the far parlor, and Mia had slipped out into the hallway on soft feet. She knew exactly where she was going. The library was her favorite room in the whole house. Tall windows let in the afternoon sun and long, bright bands that lay across the wooden floor like ribbons of gold. Nobody used it much anymore, and that suited her fine. In the center of the room stood a great old wooden table, long enough to seat 10, with heavy carved legs and a dark space beneath that she had always imagined as a sort of small castle. She crawled underneath, arranged her legs neatly, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw the housekeeper's shoes from memory. The small brass buckle, the worn crease across the toe, but she was still tracing the buckle when the library door opened. 2 pairs of shoes came in. She recognized one pair at once, polished dark leather she had sketched a week ago. Dr. Julian's shoes. The other pair was unfamiliar, slightly scuffed. "He is going to look himself," the second voice said, low and tight. "Every ledger. The whole quarter." Mia went very still. She didn't know why. She only knew her mother had told her many times that when grown-ups spoke in quiet voices, small girls weren't supposed to be near them. "Then you will do exactly what you have always done," came Julian's voice. "Calm, even warm. Prepare the usual documents. Move everything to the Geneva account before Friday." There was a soft thump above her head. The brown leather briefcase had been set down on the tabletop, directly over where she sat. Through the narrow space between the carved legs, she could see its corner. Julian's voice dropped lower. "And remember, whatever happens, under no circumstances is Mr. Moretti ever to see the blue folder." The other man murmured something in reply. Mia didn't catch the words. She didn't understand what a ledger was, or what Geneva meant, or what could possibly be so important about a folder of any color. But her ears kept the sentence, the way children keep the sounds of a lullaby, or the shape of a bad dream. The 2 pairs of shoes turned. The briefcase was lifted. The door opened and closed again. Mia waited a long time before she crawled out. Then she stood up, her sketchbook pressed tightly against her chest, and looked at the empty table. She didn't know why what she'd just heard mattered. But she knew one thing. Her mother had told her never to trouble the boss. Whatever she had just carried out from under that table, she would carry it quietly. A few days later, Mia was crossing the upstairs hallway when she saw 2 men walking together at the far end. One was Adrian. The other was Dr. Julian. They were speaking too quietly for her to hear, but her eyes went straight to Julian's hand. He was carrying the same brown leather briefcase. The clasp hadn't been fastened all the way. Through the small gap, the edge of a folder was showing. Flat, plain, blue. Mia stopped walking. She didn't know why her heart began to beat faster. She only knew she had seen that folder before, in a voice that had traveled down through a wooden table to a place where she was drawing shoes. As she stepped back into the shadow of a doorway until the 2 men had passed that evening. When the sun had gone low over the far side of the estate, and the sky turned the color of soft copper, Mia slipped out of the staff quarters with her sketchbook under one arm. She didn't have a plan. She was only walking. She rounded the low hedge that lined the garden path. And then she stopped by the edge of the lake. Standing very still with his hands in his pockets was the tall man in the dark vest. He was alone. His back was to her. Everything her mother had told her went through her small head at once. Do not disturb Mr. Moretti. Do not look at him too long. Do not speak to him. As she walked toward him anyway, her bare feet made almost no sound on the soft grass. But somehow he heard her, or felt her. He turned. When he saw who had come to stand before him, something in his face changed for half a second. Not anger, not warning, only surprise. In many years, no one had walked directly up to him like this. No one had dared. Mia wasn't afraid. She looked up at him with her sketchbook clutched tight against her small chest, and she said in her clear child's voice, "Mr. Adrian, the doctor said you are not supposed to see the blue folder." Adrian went very still. For a long moment, he simply looked down at her. Then, slowly, he did something he hadn't done for anyone in all his adult life. He lowered himself onto one knee, so that his eyes were level with hers. "Who told you that?" he asked. His voice was low, careful, the way a man might speak to something that could easily be startled away. She told him. She told him about the library and the great wooden table and the 2 pairs of shoes that had come in when she was drawing the housekeeper's buckle. She told him about the second man's tight voice. She told him about the brown leather briefcase set down on the tabletop right over her head. She told him what Dr. Julian had said, word for word. Move everything to the Geneva account before Friday. Under no circumstances Mr. Moretti ever to see the blue folder, with the strange, exact memory only very young children possess. Adrian didn't interrupt. He didn't ask her to repeat anything. He didn't promise her a single thing. When she had finished, he looked at her for another long moment. Then he lifted one hand and rested it very lightly on the top of her small head. So lightly that afterward, when she thought about it in her bed that night, she wasn't entirely sure he'd touched her at all. Then he rose to his feet and turned back to the house. Late that same night in his study, Adrian gave one short instruction to Marco. Look into the foundation. Every dollar going back 3 years. Quietly. Julian is not to know. Marco waited a beat before speaking. What's the source, sir? Adrian's eyes stayed on the window. A source no one else would think to notice. Marco left without another word. Adrian stood at the tall window for a long time, looking down toward the staff quarters, where a small yellow light was still burning in the second window from the end. From that night on, Marco began his quiet work. Nothing about the surface of the house changed. Adrian rose at the same hour, took his coffee at the same window, held the same meetings, signed the same papers. Julian came for tea on the same afternoon of the week and left his brown briefcase resting against the same leg of the same chair. Adrian accepted the quarterly report with the same short nod. He asked no more questions than he had ever asked. But something small had shifted. Men who have spent their entire lives reading other men can feel a shift like that, even when nothing is spoken. When Adrian looked at Julian now, his eyes stayed half a breath longer than before. When Julian smiled, Adrian's smile came back half a beat slower. Nothing anyone else would notice. But it was there. Marco worked at night in a small back office where the lights were kept low. He didn't use the household accountants. He used 2 men he trusted from outside the estate, men who owed him personally and would ask no questions. Within a week, he had his first report ready. He brought it to Adrian in the study, laid it on the desk, and stood in silence while Adrian read the payments to the Riverbend Center and the Hilltop Clinic. Marco said quietly. All passed through intermediary accounts abroad. Delaware, the Bahamas, Cyprus. That's not how a domestic charity moves its money, sir. Not one that only serves towns inside this state. Adrian didn't lift his head from the page. The other centers, the same pattern in every one I've checked so far. I need more time to send men out to the actual addresses. Send them tonight. Yes, sir. Marco left. Adrian sat for a long time with the report open in front of him. Somewhere in the far garden, a small girl was drawing the last of the evening light on the fountain rim, with no idea at all what she had set in motion but on the far side of the estate. In his quiet guest house office, Julian was also awake. He was not a man given to nervousness. He had lived too long inside careful lies for that. But the last 2 teas with Adrian had left a small, cold feeling at the back of his throat. Julian had learned over decades never to ignore that particular feeling. He sat under the green banker's lamp and went through every possible source in his mind. The finance officer too frightened, too dependent. No, the accountants, they only saw what Julian showed them. The secretaries, they had no access. He went through them all, one by one, and found no answer. Then he sat back in his chair and his eyes moved slowly around the room, as if searching for something misplaced. And he remembered the library the afternoon of the last tea, before Adrienne's mood had changed. The brown leather briefcase sat on the great wooden table. The finance officer stood across from him. Their careful, lowered voices. And in one of the tall reading chairs near the window, as he had turned to leave, a small, thin sketchbook with a worn brown cover, lying open on the seat, as if someone very small had recently set it down there and then run away. The color drained slowly from Julian's face. The source was a 4-year-old child that for a long minute, he didn't move. The most direct solution, to harm the housekeeper's little girl, was also the one that would destroy him fastest. Adrienne would open every drawer in every wall of the estate the moment anything happened to that child. It was unthinkable. Julian sat back down slowly in his chair. He folded his long, thin hands together on the desk. And then, gradually, a small, cold smile touched the corner of his mouth. There was another way. A way that didn't require him to lay a single finger on her. He only needed to make sure that when she opened her mouth again, no one in that house would believe a single word she said. The next afternoon, Julian took a slow walk along the back path of the estate. He carried in one hand a small paper bag of ginger candies, the kind he sometimes brought for children he saw at the clinic. He wore his usual gentle smile, that he stopped at the door of the staff quarters and knocked lightly. Grace was at the small stove, stirring a pot of soup. She turned in surprise, wiped her hands on her apron, and hurried to the door. "Dr. Voss, I only came to check on the little one," Julian said warmly. "The head housekeeper mentioned Mia had a small cough last week. Just being cautious." Grace, embarrassed by the honor of a visit from a doctor of Julian's standing, opened the door wider at once. "You are so kind, sir. Please come in. She's playing in the back room." Julian stepped inside. His eyes, calm and pleasant, moved once around the small living space in a single unhurried sweep. In the corner of the tiny back room, he saw exactly what he needed to see. A small girl seated on the floor with her sketchbook, a worn pillow on a narrow bed, and at the foot of that bed, an old wooden toy box with a loose-fitting lid. He spoke gently to Mia. He asked her to open her mouth and say "ah." He listened to her chest with the small silver stethoscope he had brought. He praised her for being such a brave girl. He pressed one ginger candy into her hand and left another 2 for later. He was gone in less than 10 minutes. 3 days later, the head housekeeper began looking for a small silver pocket watch that always sat on the tray table in the main sitting room. It had belonged to Adrienne's late father. Not valuable in itself, but one of the few things Adrienne had asked to be left exactly where it was. Always. She looked everywhere. Under the table, behind the cushions, in the drawer of the sideboard. Then, because she remembered the little girl had been in that room the day before while her mother polished the mantel, she went with a heavy heart to the staff quarters and asked gently if she might look inside Mia's toy box. Grace was pale as she lifted the lid herself. The silver pocket watch was lying inside, tucked between a stuffed rabbit and a small tin of buttons. Mia burst into tears at once. I didn't put it there." Grace turned scarlet with shame. She apologized to the head housekeeper again and again, promised it would never happen again. And in a voice she didn't know how to make gentle, she scolded her daughter for the first time in months. Mia cried harder. Not because she was being scolded, but because she was not being believed. That the story reached Adrian that same evening. He listened without any change in his face. He said nothing, but he filed it carefully in the corner of his mind where he kept everything. That same evening, Marco brought a second report to the study. "Sir, the first 2 addresses, Riverbend and Hilltop. My men went out today. There are no buildings. There are no children. Only empty lots. Weeds. One rusted fence." Adrian was silent. His fingers tapped once, softly, against the polished wood of the desk in his own quiet office at the far edge of the grounds. Julian took the news of the silver pocket watch with a very small nod. He turned to the finance officer standing across from him and let the corner of his mouth lift. "That child," he said calmly, "is beginning to sound less trustworthy already." That night, Mia sat curled on the small wooden chair by her window, the sketchbook held tight to her chest. Outside, the garden was dark and quiet. She didn't understand why her mother's eyes had looked at her the way they had that afternoon. She didn't understand why the housekeeper had gone silent when she walked past. She only knew that something had changed in the way people looked at her. and she didn't know how to make it stop. The story of the silver watch wasn't enough for Julian. One incident could still be dismissed as chance. He needed a second and a third. He needed the whole house to begin quietly to look at the little girl differently. 2 mornings later, Mia was crouched on the grass beside the rose beds, drawing the shape of a bumblebee that had settled on a leaf. Her small coat lay folded beside her. Julian was walking along the garden path, hands clasped behind his back, as if simply taking the morning air. That he paused near her, smiled his warm doctor's smile, asked if he might look at her drawing. She held it up shyly. He praised it. He said it was a very fine bumblebee. He handed her sketchbook back. As he turned to go, his hand brushed, for the briefest second, against the folded coat on the grass. Nothing anyone watching would have seen. Something small and metallic slipped from his sleeve into the shallow pocket. It was a small silver key. Old, delicate, engraved on one side with an unusual symbol, the small twin leaves he used to mark the back door of the abandoned East Wing archive. The spare he had never once let out of his own possession. He walked away, entirely calm. He was certain the head housekeeper, who tidied the servants' coats each afternoon, would find it within the day and bring it forward as she always did. She did. That evening, the housekeeper stood in the door of the staff quarters with the small silver key in her palm. Grace turned it over, frowning. She had never seen it before. She called Mia in from the back room and asked gently if she knew what it was. Mia shook her head. I never saw that. I didn't put anything in my pocket. Grace apologized to the housekeeper again, the second apology in a week, and promised she would watch her daughter more carefully. The housekeeper, thinking practically, brought the key to Dr. Julian the following morning, since the small symbol seemed to her the sort of thing a doctor's tools might carry. Julian took it in his hand, turned it over slowly, and shook his head. No, this is not mine. But it looks important. Give it back to Grace to keep safe until we find the owner. By his own careful hand, the key returned to Grace's small drawer, where it would sit unnoticed for the next several weeks. The next day, Julian walked past Mia in the long upstairs corridor. There was no one else there. He stopped, bent down slightly, and spoke in a low voice. Only for her ears. The head housekeeper will send your mother away if you ever tell the boss another one of your little stories. He straightened and walked on before she could answer. Mia stood frozen in the hallway. That evening, when Grace was tucking her in, she whispered what the doctor had said. Grace grew still. Then, troubled, she went the next morning to Julian himself and asked as politely as she could if he had said such a thing to her daughter. Julian's kind face didn't change. He gave a small, sorry smile. I would never say such a thing to a little girl, Grace. Perhaps she misunderstood. Or perhaps she dreamed it. Children her age often confuse what they hear with what they imagine. Grace believed him. Of course, she believed him. He was Dr. Julian. He had cared for the boss's own father in his final years. Every person in the house respected him, but she went back to the staff quarters that afternoon, and, with a tightness in her voice she didn't want to have, told Mia that she must not make up stories about grown people. Not ever. Mia said nothing. That night, she sat by the window with her sketchbook open on her small lap. She turned to a fresh page and picked up her pencil. For the first time in her whole small life, she drew a sun with a cloud pulled all the way across its face. From that week on, Julian began to find small reasons to speak with Grace. He greeted her in the hall in the mornings. He asked gently whether her back was troubling her again after the long hours of scrubbing. He asked how she managed all on her own with a child of that age. He told her more than once that she was a good mother and that he could see how hard she worked. Grace, who had gone years without a kind word from anyone above her station, felt herself warm each time he stopped to speak with her. She began to trust his kindness, the way one trusts warm water in a cold house. And then, slowly, Julian began to worry with her. I only mention it because I care for the two of you, he said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the back parlor while she polished the wood. Your daughter has such a bright imagination. But you must be careful, Grace. Mr. Moretti is not a man who welcomes disturbance. He does not like children in the way most men do. He is very private. Grace listened, her rag going still in her hand. She wanders too much. She stares at him. She tells little stories that make no sense. Last week, the housekeeper was in tears over that silver watch. If these small things keep happening, they will notice, Grace. And if he decides the arrangement no longer suits him, he let the sentence hang. Grace understood. She understood far too well. She had nowhere else to go. No family who would take them in. No savings that would last a month. The staff quarters behind the house were the only roof her daughter had ever known that didn't shift every few months. To lose this place was to lose everything. I will speak to her, she said quietly that evening. She sat down on the small bed opposite her daughter. She took Mia's small hands in her own. Her voice was not raised, but it was firmer than any voice Mia had ever heard from her. From tonight, you will not go near Mr. Adrian anymore. You will not speak to him. You will not stand where he can see you. If you disturb him one more time, we will have to leave this house. Do you understand me? Mia, do you understand what that means? Mia looked up at her mother, her large eyes filling slowly. She didn't fully understand. Only a little while ago, the tall man had rested his hand on top of her head, so gently that even now, in her small memory, it felt like something warm placed there and then gone. Now her mother was telling her she couldn't go near him at all. She nodded. She bit her lower lip so that it wouldn't tremble. She didn't cry that night. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't draw. She lay on her side on the small bed, the sketchbook pressed tight against her chest, and looked at the wall at almost the same hour. In the study of the main house, Marco laid a third and final report on Adrienne's desk, every one of them, sir. Riverbend, Hilltop, Ashwood, Fairview, all of them. Empty lots. Empty buildings. No centers. No clinics. No children. He paused. The total we can trace so far runs into the millions, across nearly 10 years. Adrian didn't speak. His finger tapped once, twice, against the polished wood of the desk. Then it stilled. He rose. He was going to Julian's guest house that very night. He would end this with his own hands, but before he reached the door, another matter reached him first. One small, ordinary matter. And it was enough to make him pause that the next morning, before the dew had lifted from the garden, Mia was walking back from the fountain when she saw a familiar figure moving through the far end of the ground floor corridor. Dr. Julian. In his hand, the brown briefcase under his arm, wrapped now in a piece of dark cloth, as if he had tried to hide it in haste. But the flat, unmistakable shape of a blue folder was still visible. She watched from the shadow of a tall vase as he passed through a door she had never seen anyone use. At the end of a long hallway in the east wing, she heard the small, quiet turn of a lock. Her mother's warning was still fresh in her ears from the night before. You will not go near Mr. Adrian. You will not speak to him. She stood there for a long moment, her small heart beating fast. Then she turned and ran. She ran up the wide back staircase, 2 floors at a time. She ran down the long carpeted hall of the upper floor. She ran until she saw the tall figure in the dark vest at the far end, pausing to speak with one of the guards. Mr. Adrian. Her voice was small and out of breath. She clutched the sketchbook to her chest with both arms. He turned to, I just saw the doctor. He was carrying the blue folder. He took it into the locked room behind the old archive. He locked the door. Adrian went very still for half a second. Then he moved, Marco. His right hand was already halfway down the hall before he finished the word. Marco caught his eye, understood, and was gone at once. 3 men followed him. Their footsteps disappeared into the far corridor. Adrian remained where he was. Mia stood in front of him, breathing hard, her small chest rising and falling. She didn't speak. She only waited. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Marco returned. His face was carefully blank. Sir, the room is empty. There is nothing in it. No folder. No papers. Only shelves and dust. The door wasn't even locked when we opened it. The silence that followed those words was not a long silence. It was only 3 seconds. But it was long enough that Adrian looked down at the small girl in front of him. She was already looking up at him. Her large eyes were clear, waiting, patient. And into the space Marco's report had left, she asked in the smallest voice he had ever heard from her. Do you believe me? Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. He didn't say she had lied. He would never have said that. But he didn't say the other word either. He didn't say yes. He hesitated. 3 seconds. That was all. But children who have already been told twice this week not to make up stories know exactly what a grown man's 3 seconds mean. That something in her eyes changed. It wasn't tears. It was smaller and quieter than tears. It was the small light that had been there since the afternoon by the lake, dimming down to almost nothing. She didn't cry. She only took one small step backward, tightened her arms around the sketchbook against her chest, turned, and walked away down the long corridor. Adrian moved half a step forward. He opened his mouth to call her back, but the words didn't come in time. And by the time they might have come, she was already gone around the far corner. He looked down at his own hand. The same hand that 3 weeks earlier had rested for one moment on the top of her small head, so lightly that she hadn't been sure he'd touched her at all. From that day forward, she didn't come near him again. 3 weeks passed. Every road Marco followed came to the same closed door. Every ledger was clean. Every witness had nothing to say. Every account that had once looked strange now looked perfectly ordinary. Its earlier trails wiped so carefully that a stranger looking at the same numbers today would have called them proof of a well-run charity. Julian had moved everything the moment he understood what was happening, and he had moved it in ways that left no fingerprints behind. Julian himself seemed calmer with each passing week. He came to tea. He smiled his warm smile. He even suggested gently that perhaps it was time to open 2 more centers in the north of the state. Since the foundation had done such fine work in recent years, Adrian nodded through the meeting. He signed nothing. More than once, in the quiet of his own study, he asked himself the question a man in his position was never supposed to ask. What if I was wrong? What if the whole thing began in the small mistake of a 4-year-old who had, in the end, only misheard something under a table? And each time the question rose in him, another image rose with it, and wouldn't be pushed away. The eyes of a small girl in the upstairs hallway, looking up at him with all the trust she still had in the world, waiting for one single word from him. And his 3 seconds of silence, the estate returned to what it had always been. Long, silent corridors. Staff who lowered their heads as he passed. Meals taken at a long table with only one chair drawn out. The heavy, disciplined quiet of a house built to hold no laughter. Only one thing was different. And it was a thing so small that no one but him would ever have noticed. There was no longer the faint sound of a pencil moving across paper in the upstairs hallway. He passed the tall window on the 2nd floor where she used to sit cross-legged, drawing the tiles. Emptied. He passed the old tree beside the lake where she had once bent over a sketchbook with the sun on her hair. Emptied. He passed the back stone step where she had knelt with her nose almost against the ground, waiting patiently for a bird to hold still. Empty. At night, he stood by the tall window of his study and looked out toward the staff quarters. The warm yellow light in the 2nd window from the end was still lit at bedtime. But the curtain, which had once hung loose enough to show the outline of a mother reading and a small child listening, was now pulled all the way closed. Corner to corner. He stood at the glass and understood something he had never understood in his life. He missed her. He, who had built his empire on the certainty that missing anyone was a weakness. He, who had spent almost 20 years not missing a single soul on this earth. He missed a 4-year-old girl he had spoken perhaps 5 sentences to in his whole life. Marco came in one evening with his report and stopped short, choosing his words with great care. Sir, every direction is closed. Without something new, we may have to close the file. Adrian didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the far corner of the garden for a long moment. Then, without turning, he asked a question Marco wasn't expecting. The housekeeper's little girl. Has she eaten today? Marco didn't know what to say. In 10 years of standing beside this man, he had never once heard him ask such a thing. I'll find out, sir. Later that evening, quietly, without being told to, the head housekeeper carried a small extra plate of soft bread and warm soup out to the staff quarters and left it at Grace's door. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He sat at his desk in the dark, looking out through the tall window at the gardens beyond. The house had never felt so wide. The rooms had never felt so long. The silence, which he had built his whole life to protect, had never felt so heavy. That the next morning, before the sun had risen high enough to burn off the mist, Adrian went out to the garden. He hadn't planned it. He didn't know why his feet took him toward the lake. Perhaps because it was the only place in the whole estate that still felt as if it belonged to something other than an empire. The grass was silver with dew. The far edge of the water was still hidden in low fog. He walked slowly along the low stone path, past the fountain, past the roses, until he reached the old tree at the water's edge where he had first seen her, that afternoon 3 months ago, bent over her page with a great yellow sun rising above her small hand. A something small lay in the wet grass under the tree. He stopped. He knelt down. It was the sketchbook. The worn brown cover was damp with dew. She must have dropped it days ago, and forbidden to come near this place, had never dared to return for it. He lifted it carefully with both hands. He brushed the moisture from the cover with the side of his sleeve, as if he were handling something fragile. He carried it back to the house without stopping. He walked past the head housekeeper, who lowered her head without a word. He walked into his study, closed the door, and set the sketchbook down in the center of the polished wooden desk that for a long time he didn't open it. He only stood there looking at it, both hands flat on the desk beside it. Then at last, he opened the cover. The first page, the housekeeper's shoes. The small brass buckle drawn from memory with the little worn crease across the toe. At the second page, the dark birds on the maple branch. 6 of them in a row, arranged exactly as they had been on that afternoon. He passed the library door. The third page, a man in a dark vest, seated alone by the edge of the water. Above his head, a great yellow sun. Around him, flowers of every color a small pencil could reach. For Adrian's throat tightened. He turned the page. He turned it again. And what he began to see, page after page, stopped his breath. Dr. Julian, drawn in the small, careful lines of a child, with the brown leather briefcase in his hand and the flat edge of a folder just visible inside it. Dr. Julian in another drawing, standing in a corridor, speaking to a man Adrian didn't immediately recognize, but Marco had described to him in one of his reports weeks ago. The outside accountant of the foundation, a small silver key drawn on its own page in astonishing detail, right down to the twin leaf symbol engraved on its side, an old wooden door with the same twin leaf symbol carved into its worn brass plate. Adrian knew that door the instant he saw it. It was the door at the back of the East Wing archive, in the corridor no one used. And the next page after that, Dr. Julian standing directly in front of that door, the brown briefcase in one hand, the blue folder held in the other. Adrian didn't move. He sat down slowly in his chair. He turned back to the first drawing and looked at it again, then forward, one page at a time, all the way through. A 4-year-old child, in her wandering days across the corridors of his house, had recorded, without knowing what she was recording, every single piece of the case he had spent months failing to prove. Not one professional investigator could have gathered this in the same time. He remembered every place he had ever passed her. The upstairs hallway, the library window, the garden path. He had thought she was drawing birds and butterflies and floor tiles. She had been drawing everything. He reached for the small bell on his desk and rang it once. When Marco came in, Adrian didn't explain. He held out the sketchbook. Follow me. Now. The two of them left the study and turned toward the East Wing. On the way, Adrian stopped only once. At the staff kitchen, where Grace was folding table linens. He asked her in a voice she had never heard from him before whether she still had the small silver key the housekeeper had given her to keep for its owner. Grace, startled, went at once to her small drawer and brought it back. Adrian said only quietly that he would return it to the right person. She had no way of knowing that the right person was standing before her already. He, Marco, and 3 of Marco's most trusted men walked in silence down the long, disused corridor of the East Wing. Dust lay along the tops of the picture frames. The wall lamps hadn't been switched on in years. At the far end stood the old wooden door with the small brass plate. The twin leaf symbol, worn but unmistakable. Adrian slid the small silver key into the lock. It turned out the door opened. Inside was the old archive, as everyone in the household remembered it. Long shelves, boxes of medical records from decades past, the smell of dry paper and time. But in the far corner, half hidden behind a tall bookshelf draped with a heavy piece of gray cloth, stood something the household didn't remember. A small steel safe bolted to the floor, and beside it, resting on a low shelf, a neat stack of leather cases. Marco stepped forward and worked the lock on the first case. It opened. Inside lay the blue folder. Beneath it, in the other cases, lay everything else. Double ledgers kept in Julian's neat handwriting alongside the false ones he had shown Adrian each quarter. Invoices for centers that had never existed. Contracts signed with directors whose names had been invented. Copies of wire transfers moving in careful patterns from the Foundation's main account through Delaware, through the Bahamas, through Cyprus, and at last into a single private account in Geneva. And at the bottom, wrapped in a strip of black cloth, a small leather notebook. Marco opened it. His face didn't usually change. It changed now. Sir, it's his own record. Amounts. Dates. Names of the men he's been paying inside our own accounts office. Even the plan for the next 2 years. Everything. He turned another page. His jaw tightened. The total we can trace goes past 20 million. Over almost 10 years. Adrian didn't speak. He lifted the blue folder in one hand and stood there in the dim, dusty light with it, looking at nothing in particular. In his mind, there was only one image, and it wouldn't move away to the eyes of a small girl in an upstairs corridor, looking up at him with the last of her trust, asking in the smallest voice he had ever heard, "Do you believe me?" In the 3 seconds in which he had said nothing at all, that the truth was in his hand at last. Every ledger, every transfer, every crooked signature of the last 10 years. But what struck him hardest, standing there, was not the $20 million stolen from the children who had never received it. What struck him hardest was that a 4-year-old had told him the truth from the very first day, and he had been the one who didn't believe her. Marco waited. The 3 men behind him waited. It was the moment, and every one of them understood it. One word from Adrian, and Julian would be dragged out of his guest house before nightfall. Adrian didn't give that word. "Not yet," he said. His voice was low. "Put men on him. Every step, every phone call, every visitor. I want to know when he coughs. But do not touch him." Marco frowned faintly. "Sir, there's something I need to do first." Marco held his eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded once. He didn't ask what. He had worked beside this man for a decade. He understood, without another word, exactly what needed to be done first. And by whom? Adrian stepped out of the archive with the small worn sketchbook still tucked carefully under his arm. He didn't go back to his study. He walked straight out through the back doors of the house, down the long garden path, past the fountain, past the roses, toward the water. The late afternoon sun lay long and golden across the surface of the lake. The light was soft, the kind that made everything look older and gentler than it truly was. Under the old tree at the edge of the lake, a small figure sat cross-legged in the grass. Mia had come back to this place, not because her mother had told her she could, not because anyone had invited her. She had come because in the last 3 weeks, she had learned from watching from behind curtains that the tall man in the dark vest no longer sat here anymore. He had stopped coming to the lake. And so this had become the one place in the whole estate where she could still be alone without breaking her promise. In her small hands, she held a short pencil and a folded piece of scrap paper the kitchen woman had given her. She was drawing slowly, awkwardly, without the familiar weight of the sketchbook across her knees. Her cheeks were smudged faintly with graphite. She didn't hear him coming. He walked softly on the grass. But when a shadow fell gently across the paper in front of her, she looked up. Adrian was there. He didn't stand at a distance the way he always had before. He didn't stop 3 paces away. He came close. And then, in the quiet of that late afternoon, he did the one thing he had never done for another human being in his adult life. He knelt down. He lowered himself onto one knee in the grass in front of her, so that his eyes were level with hers. And then he shifted lower still, until he was sitting back on his heels, the way a father might sit before a small child. Mia's large eyes widened. He set the worn brown sketchbook down carefully on the grass beside her. She recognized it at once. The small light in her eyes lifted, brightened for one instant, and then dimmed again. She didn't reach for it. She didn't touch it. She only looked up at him. And in the smallest voice he had ever heard from her, smaller even than the voice from 3 weeks ago, she asked him the same question she had asked him then. "Do you believe me?" Adrian didn't look away this time. He didn't explain. He didn't tell her about the archive or the folder or the notebook or the $20 million. He didn't offer her a reason for what he had done or failed to do. He looked straight into her eyes and answered her plainly, "I should have believed you then." Mia didn't fully understand every word. She was 4 years old, but she understood the one thing that mattered. He was telling her he was sorry. She looked at him for a long time with her large, clear eyes. It wasn't the look of a child judging a grown man. It was something else. The quiet, careful look of a very small person deciding whether it was safe to trust again. Then, slowly, she scooted across the grass on her small legs, and she sat down beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't lean against him. She simply sat there, close enough that her small knee almost touched his. Adrian, the man before whom hundreds of grown men lowered their heads without being told, sat cross-legged in the grass beside a 4-year-old girl, looking out at the golden water without saying a single word. But in that moment, the great cold house behind them was no longer cold. That some distance away, near the low garden wall, Grace had come out to bring in a basket of dried linens. She stopped where she stood. One hand rose slowly to her mouth. She didn't move. She only stood there, looking at the two small figures under the tree by the water. And she understood, all at once and with a terrible clarity, that Julian had been lying to her all along. At almost the same moment, in the small guest house at the far edge of the estate, Julian's private phone rang. His finance officer's voice came through the line, tight and shaking. "They've been in the archive. They have the folder. They have everything." Julian stood up, so quickly his chair scraped back against the floor. The color left his face. He knew in that single instant that everything was over. That night, Julian didn't run. Not yet. He knew the safe in the archive had been found. He knew the blue folder was already in Adrienne's hands. But he also knew there was one place still unopened. A small back room in the old medical archive. The Moretti family records dating from the years he had cared for Adrienne's father, where he had, over the last decade, quietly hidden the last of his paper trail. As the family doctor, he had walked in and out of that room for years without a single question from anyone. Those papers, if they were found, would name the men in the accounts office who had helped him. They would name the banks. They would name the men in Geneva. He couldn't leave them behind. At near midnight, he entered the east wing through the service corridor. He carried a small tool bag. He went to the electrical panel that fed the archive lights, loosened the wires, and forced a short across the main line. The sparks were small, but they were exactly where he wanted them, close to old, dry cardboard boxes he had already pushed against the wall. He walked out. By the time he was halfway across the garden, the first orange flicker had begun to lift behind the tall east wing windows. That the fire alarms in the great house began to scream. Within minutes, the entire estate was awake. Staff ran through the corridors in nightclothes. Lights snapped on floor by floor. Marco was already on the stone terrace, shouting orders, forming a perimeter, sending men in pairs through each wing to sweep every room. Get every person out. Count every head at the front lawn. The east wing was already glowing behind its windows. Smoke was pouring from the upper vents. At the far edge of the front lawn, Grace was calling her daughter's name into the crowd of gathered staff, turning face after face again and again. Her voice grew smaller each time. The head housekeeper hadn't seen her. The kitchen women hadn't seen her. No one had seen her. Grace ran across the wet grass and grabbed Adrienne's arm with both hands. Her tears were falling before she could speak. "Mia is still inside." She went back for her sketchbook. She went back. Adrienne didn't wait for the men returning from the wings. He didn't wait for the fire brigade, whose sirens were still faint in the far distance. He pulled off his suit jacket, dipped it fast into the stone basin of the fountain, and threw it up over his head and shoulders. He was already moving toward the front doors. Marco shouted after him. Adrienne didn't stop. Inside, the smoke was thick. His eyes stung. The heat pressed against his skin like a heavy hand. He called her name once, then again, his voice already going rough. He took the staircase to the second floor, 3 steps at a time. The hallway where she used to sit and draw the tiles was empty. The window seat by the library was empty. He turned toward the east wing. The corridor was pitch black with smoke. He couldn't see his own outstretched hand. He dropped low and moved forward on one knee, still calling her name. Then he heard it, small, faint. A single cough. He followed it. In a small side room, near the servants' back stairs, huddled against the wall with her small knees pulled up to her chest, was Mia. Her face was smeared with soot. Her hair was falling loose from its ponytail. And clutched tight against her chest with both arms was the worn brown sketchbook. She had come back for it. She had come back for the one thing in her whole small life that no one could ever take from her. Adrian scooped her up in one motion. He pressed her face into his shoulder with one hand and covered her nose and mouth with the wet edge of his jacket. He turned back down the corridor. Behind him, a section of ceiling gave way and came down onto the floor he had just crossed. He didn't look back. He carried her down the smoke-filled stairs, through the hall, and out through the great front doors into the cool night air. Grace ran to them and dropped to her knees on the stone. She threw her arms around both of them at once, sobbing into her daughter's hair. Mia didn't let go of Adrienne's shoulder right away. She held on. Marco came running up the drive. His black suit was streaked across one cheek. Sir, we caught him at the service gate. He had a suitcase of cash and a false passport. Adrian gave a single small nod. He didn't turn to look up behind them. The east wing of the great house burned against the dark sky. In Mia's small arms, still pressed to her chest, the worn brown sketchbook was safe. Only one corner of the cover had been scorched black by the smoke. In the days that followed the fire, everything came into the light. Every ledger recovered from the archive matched the entries in Julian's own private notebook. Every wire transfer was traced. The finance officer confessed within hours. The foundation's assets were frozen, and the greater part of the stolen millions was recovered from the Geneva account before the week was out. Julian himself was quietly removed and turned over to those whose business it was to deal with him. Adrian didn't stop there. He dissolved the old board of the Moretti Charitable Foundation and appointed a new one with an independent auditor whose reports would come to his own desk every single month. He opened at last the real children's centers. The false ones had only pretended to be. He walked in person through the first one on the day it was ready, and he brought a small girl with him. In the quiet months that followed, Adrian began, one careful decision at a time, to close down the darkest corners of the empire his father had left him. He said to Marco one evening, standing at the tall window of the study, "If a 4-year-old could see me under a yellow sun, perhaps it's time I began to become that man." Grace and Mia stayed. The east wing was rebuilt. Adrian didn't try to replace the father Mia had never known. He didn't ask her to call him anything but Mr. Adrian. He was only there, every evening, every morning. Always somewhere in the house. She could find him if she wanted to. The old worn sketchbook, the corners still black from the fire, was set inside a plain wooden frame and hung on the wall of his study, where he could see it from his desk. And in that great house of quiet corridors, Mia became the one person who never once saw the mafia boss. When she looked at Adrian many months later, on a warm afternoon, the golden light fell across the lake exactly as it had on the first day Adrian had ever seen her draw. He walked out to the garden. Under the old tree by the water sat a small girl with a new sketchbook open across her knees. This time, he didn't stand at a distance. He walked over and sat down quietly beside her. Mia wasn't surprised. She only smiled and kept drawing. A few minutes later, she finished. She tore the page carefully from the sketchbook and held it out to him with both small hands. On the paper was a large house. In front of the house stood 3 figures, a woman, a little girl, and a tall man in a dark vest. There were no guards, no guns, no empire. Only 3 people standing close together under a great yellow sun. Adrian held the drawing. His hand trembled very slightly. And for the first time in his whole life, he understood that the 4-year-old girl who had once sat by this lake and drawn him under a sun had seen the human being inside him long before he had been able to see it in himself. Dear friends, sometimes the person who believes in us most is not the one who knows us best, but the one who looks at us with the clearest eyes. The eyes that the darkness of the world has not yet learned to cloud. And perhaps the most painful thing in life is not being betrayed by someone we trusted, but losing our own trust in the one who has always told us the truth. Has there ever been a time in your life when you didn't believe someone, and later realized they had been telling the truth all along? What did you do to make it right? If this story touched you, please share it so more people can hear it. May there always be someone in your life who sees the true human being inside you.